Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about my tight end rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about my top 6 tight ends. And you may be wondering, Andrew, why are you only covering the top 6? Why aren't you perhaps expanding the list to a top 12, 15? Well, in my opinion, going into the 2021 season, it's ever so important to grab top-tier talent at the tight end position. Again, as of the last 5 seasons, the tight end position has fallen off of a cliff in terms of individual opportunity, touchdowns, everything across the board, even to fantasy point totals. It's been an absolute dumpster fire at the tight end position. In fact, looking at the tight end position just last season, there were only 3 tight ends that surpassed 150 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. To put that in perspective for you guys, there were 6 kickers and 3 team defenses that eclipsed 150 fantasy points last year. So why not go ahead, invest in a player that is certainly not only going to avoid giving you headaches throughout the season, but is going to give you a significant fantasy point advantage throughout the season. Throughout today's episode, we're going to talk about the statistics that justify this thought process and, of course, give credence to the process of taking a tight end early, investing in the position, and making sure that we're giving our teams the best overall opportunity for success in 2021. Now, before we begin today's video, I want to thank you guys for the incredible support. Again, you guys have come out, click that like button, comment down below. I've seen a lot of new people joining the community Discord server. Really do appreciate building this community up going throughout the 2021 season. For those of you who have not yet already joined the Discord or subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. They're both free, and they're certainly both going to help you throughout the 2021 season. Again, this channel is going to be pumping out content on the daily throughout the entirety of this offseason, going into the regular season. The last day we'll be posting just regular season is going to be January 9th of 2022. Every single day, I promise, I'm putting out content, trying to help you guys win a championship. So if you like today's content and the other stuff that I've produced, consider subscribing, help yourself out going into 2021. All right, so we're talking about the tight end position, but specifically talking about the top 6. And I wanted to go ahead and present some juicy statistics that kind of give you guys a little bit of an advantage, understanding why exactly I prefer top end tight ends. And I want to go ahead and invest in them accordingly. So the stats that you're going to see up on screen are drop off in production from the years of 2018 through 2020. So what I went ahead and did is I went and I accumulated the averages of the top 12 at the tight end, wide receiver, and running back positions and calculated them accordingly. So on the left side, we see, of course, the ranks from 1 through 12 at the tight end, wide receiver, and running back position. Those are the averages of the players who finished at that respective position. So again, the number 1 tight end for the last 3 seasons has averaged, and I quote, 236.39 fantasy points, and goes down accordingly. Now, on the right side, we have percentages. That exactly is the percentage of drop-off that we see at every single position accordingly. So again, the difference between the tight end 1, who is the 100% ceiling at the position, and the, let's say, for example, tight end 2, is about 11.5%. So that's the kind of drop-off that we see. But again, like I've mentioned before, the running back position does see a significant drop-off, but in comparison to all positions in fantasy football, the tight end position is the most deadly in terms of drop-off in production, because after a couple names, we end up seeing steep declines and just a complete wasteland of guys that are scoring 100 points, 5 points, 6 points a week, not getting opportunities, and you're hoping that they score a touchdown in that given week. Otherwise, they're leaving you with a performance that could end up jeopardizing your week and potentially losing you a contest. Going into the 2021 season, it's a 17-game season, but ultimately, hopefully, everybody's going to play a Week 16 championship. If you play in one of those hardcore leagues in which only 6 out of the 12 teams make the playoffs, every single win is going to be that much more important. So we have to make sure that the tight end position isn't jeopardizing our goal of winning a 2021 fantasy football championship. I wanted to go ahead and, again, put these numbers up on screen and kind of give you guys an understanding of the narrative that I'm trying to convey, because, again, it's all about taking guys within the top 6. If we go ahead and, for example, focus on the tight end number 4 over the last 3 seasons from 2018 to 2020, they've averaged 168.73. That kind of gives us an understanding as to what potentially the tight end 4 could produce this year. Now, of course, there's fluctuations in which seasons the guys produce more and or less, and we're just going to have to play with the average and see what we do. But of course, in my anticipation, I know who I think is going to be number 4, and I think he could potentially even surpass that number. But for the sake of this explanation, We'll talk about the tight end 4 averaging those kind of numbers. Now, in comparison to the running back and wide receiver position, if you wanted to go ahead and stack it up accordingly, the number 4 tight end over the last 3 seasons has been pretty much equivalent in terms of total fantasy point production to the wide receiver number 24 and the running back 20. That's pretty much where you want to go ahead and potentially take the tight end 4. But the question is, why would you want to draft the tight end 4 over the wide receiver 24 and or RB20? The explanation is relatively clear in my eyes. When we look at who the potential tight end 4 is this upcoming season, it's only a short list of players that can really compete for that spot. In comparison to the wide receiver and running back positions, there have been so much volatility, turnaround, injuries that have forced a lot of the rankings to shake up year in and year out. I mean, if we look at the wide receiver position, just the top 12 wide receivers, in fact, we've seen 11 new wide receivers become first-time wide receiver ones in just the past 2 seasons. I mean, the running back position, very similar. We had, I think it was 9 new running backs in the last 2 seasons have been RB1s for the first time in their careers. There's so much turnover at the top and even in the wide receiver to RB2 range every single year due to, again, players moving to different teams, players getting injured, players getting drafted, that again, there's a lot more risk in potentially investing in an RB20 and or a wide receiver 24. On top of that point, look at the drop-off in production. In comparison to the wide receiver position and running back position, the drop-off between the tight end number 4 and tight end number 5 may not seem like a lot, 11 points, but I can assure you without a doubt, the drop-off in production between the wide receiver 24 and 25 is 4 points, and between the RB20 and RB21 is 5 points. So in fact, you're potentially getting an even better investment, because if in fact your competition isn't immediately investing in the tight end position and guys are going ahead and waiting, you could potentially end up with the number 4 tight end while someone else in your league invested in the RB20. The difference between those two investments are when you pull up to the next round and select the running back, it's going to be far less of a drop-off than they were to if they went after a tight end in the following round. There's so much value that is hidden in fantasy football. I just wanted to give that perspective and explain to you guys again, the drop-off in production is a huge statistic in regards to fantasy football and specifically the tight end position as a whole. So hopefully I've gone ahead and conveyed a little bit of an understanding there. On top of that, a lot of people are talking about Travis Kelce being a first-round pick. The last time I personally saw a tight end come off the board in the first round was Jimmy Graham, Rob Gronkowski. In the past decade, of course, they were coming off of career-defining performances. Travis Kelce, of course, coming off of a career-defining performance, the best, statistical season of his career. But ultimately, I think if in fact you're going to be one of those teams that invests in Travis Kelce in the first round, there is an incredible argument for it. We'll go ahead and talk about that once we get to Travis Kelce, who will be my number 1 ranked tight end. It's not a surprise. I don't need to go ahead and hide that from you guys. The final statistic I wanted to mention before we get into my top 6 rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season is the fact that though I'm spending relatively high draft capital for tight ends, I'm not spending it on just some random bozo. Like, I'm trying to pick up tight ends. I'm trying to draft tight ends that are not only the best in the league, but are leading their respective teams in targets. The statistic I found was since 2015, tight ends who have led their team in total targets have finished within the top 5 of the half PPR rankings 85% of the time. We're looking for guys that are going to finish in the top 5, and that's why we're drafting in there, because like I mentioned earlier, the volatility of other positions shifting rankings is far more than the tight end position, because we know there's a subset of guys that are going to ball out if they stay healthy, which we're going to hopefully invest in this upcoming season. So let's get into my top 6 rankings at the position. Take these stats off. We begin with our number 6, Kyle Pitts of the Atlanta Falcons. Now, the reason I wanted to go ahead and highlight Kyle Pitts is because though there's a lot of hype revolving around Kyle Pitts and that hype has kind of lifted him in terms of ADP and he's being selected relatively early, I do believe there's a justification to grabbing him early, because not only does he have the talent, but he's going to have the opportunity this season to prove everyone that he was drafted number 4 overall and he's the highest drafted NFL tight end in the history of the league. Again, that is an unbelievable statistic. They took him number 4 overall. Never has that before been done. A tight end, I think in 1973, was drafted 5th overall in the draft. Kyle Pitts is going to be a game changer, and especially in this Atlanta Falcons offense. Now, I'll explain to you the reasons why. Of course, Kyle Pitts is coming off of an incredible season at Florida in which he had 43 receptions for 770 yards and 12 receiving touchdowns in just 8 games. He is a wide receiver with the tight end's body, and to be honest, he doesn't even have a tight end's body. He could easily line him up out wide like the Raiders do with Darren Waller. If you go ahead and check out the statistics in terms of what Darren Waller was able to do last season with the Raiders, they lined him out wide nearly 33% of the times he ran a route. They could very easily do this with Kyle Pitts, transform him, though he's a tight end naturally, into a wide receiver, because again, this team outside of Calvin Ridley doesn't really have any other imposing threats against him in terms of target opportunity and the ability to garner targets from Matt Ryan, who will certainly be throwing the ball a lot this season. When we look at what Matt Ryan has done in just the last 3 seasons alone, he's had 600 plus passing attempts each of the last 3 years. That in itself, an incredible statistic. This team, of course, wants to throw the ball a lot. In fact, looking at the statistics of last year, the wide receiver positions for the Atlanta Falcons was targeted 396 times last season. Russell Gage had 110 of those. You think Russell Gage is going to have over 100 targets once again this year? I know Julio was out last year and they really didn't have any other options, but Kyle Pitts, you're in line for a lot of statistics coming in your direction. Of course, the running back position for this team was targeted 105 times last year. Mike Davis can fill that in, but is he going to have all of those targets? Absolutely not. The tight end position was targeted 104 times last season for the Atlanta Falcons, and that was with Dirk Cutter as the offensive coordinator. Now you bring in Arthur Smith, a guy that absolutely loves to use 2 tight end sets. Of course, last season with Anthony Firkser and Jonnu Smith both getting over 50 targets. When we look at the amount of percentages that Ryan Tannehill targeted his tight ends last year, it wasn't an accident. This offense for Tennessee wanted to go ahead and involve their tight ends as much as they possibly could. When I looked at the statistics, Ryan Tannehill threw the ball during the regular season 481 times. 138 of those targets went to tight ends. That's 28.7% of the targets are going to the tight end position. So again, even with Hayden Hurst in this offense, I'm not worried about what Kyle Pitts is capable of doing because there's a boatload of targets up for grabs. Again, if in fact the Atlanta Falcons were built like the Tennessee Titans, I'd be afraid. But I don't expect Matt Ryan to throw the ball 480 times this season. I expect him to throw 600 plus times like he has done year in and year out, because that is exactly what this offense is built to be. I mean, again, when you're a new head coach coming into an organization, you're going to try to restructure it, but it's built in a way so where they want to pass consistently, and that's how their offensive line has been built. But the last thing I wanted to mention in terms of the potential of what Kyle Pitts could end up seeing this season. In the last 10 seasons of Julio Jones' career with the Atlanta Falcons, he has averaged statistics that would have, in a 16-game season, if he stays healthy consistently, would have averaged 163 targets, 105 receptions, 1,591 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns for 255 total fantasy points. Kyle Pitts is going to get targets. That is clear. Calvin Ridley is going to be the number 1 guy on this team. And yes, Kyle Pitts is not going to lead his team in total targets. But I absolutely believe 100 targets is very capable. And if in fact you're going to see a rookie tight end pull in over 100 targets, we could end up seeing the 3rd tight end in the past decade that has finished as a tight end 1. Again, there's only been 2 other tight ends that have finished as a tight end 1 in their rookie season. That was Rob Gronkowski and Evan Ingram. So again, though there are a lot of hurdles for Kyle Pitts to surpass, I think he has all the momentum and he is in a perfect offense to serve his skill base. And the quarterback is definitely going to be looking in his direction as he has. I mean, he sent the ball to Hayden Hurst 88 times last season. I'm certain Matt Ryan will be far more enthusiastic about throwing the ball in the direction of a guy like Kyle Pitts. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next tight end, the number 5 overall, which is the thumbnail for today's video, Mark Andrews. Now, Mark Andrews has absolutely been a stud tight end. In the last 2 seasons, he's finished as the number 4 and the number 5 tight end. In fact, from 2019 to 2020, he's averaged 10.91 fantasy points per game in a 29-game span. Last season, Mark Andrews saw a little bit of a dip in productivity, but also was because of the fact that he wasn't healthy and didn't play a full season. Again, he only played 14 games, and that definitely kind of hamstrung him in terms of his overall potential. But the issue that I have with Mark Andrews, and the reason I have him here at the number 5 spot in comparison to something higher, is because of his volatility. Like I mentioned, in the 29 games that he's played, he's only had 1 game of 10 plus targets and 1 game of over 100 receiving yards. Yet, he's had 17 receiving touchdowns in those 29 games, and 8 of those touchdowns coming from 4 separate games. Yes, when Mark Andrews pops off, he scores in bunches. There have been 4 games in which he's had 2 touchdowns. A lot of his statistics are being pushed into one direction, while a lot of the other performances that he's put up have been quite underwhelming to say the very least, but that's the tight end position as a whole. I'm not going to make excuses for it. That's just what it is. When we looked at the entire productivity of Mark Andrews for the last 2 seasons, only 16 of his 29 games surpassed 10 fantasy points. Again, that's touchdown dependency and extreme volatility. And though that may be the case, I'm still 100% on board with taking Mark Andrews because he is significantly better than the rest of the tight end field. When we look at what he's been able to do against the AFC North, teams like the Cincinnati Bengals, Cleveland Browns, and Pittsburgh Steelers, over the last 2 seasons, he's averaged 12.82 fantasy points per game against them. That is extremely promising because, again, he plays them 6 out of these 17 games this upcoming season, which of course is going to help him at least create more of a baseline in comparison to what his strength of schedule ends up looking like this upcoming season. The other thing that's relatively promising is that, of course, he's led his team in targets for the last 2 seasons. In terms of last year specifically, Mark Andrews had ran 364 total routes, targeted 88 times, which makes it a target percentage of 24.17. And then in terms of target share, when we take his 88 total targets in comparison, of course, to the games that he played in, to the rest of the field and the amount of opportunities and passing attempts that Lamar Jackson had sent out to receiving options, he had garnered 24.51% of the team's target share, nearly 25%. Again, 1 out of every 4 passes is going in the direction of Mark Andrews, and that's extremely promising. Now, the thing that even makes it more exciting is that they've brought in receiver help to pull pressure off of Mark Andrews this upcoming season. Again, when you bring in a Sammy Watkins, Rashad Bateman, you have Marquise Brown still in this offense, I truly do believe it is going to set them up for far more success. And though it may seem like bringing in wide receiver help isn't going to certainly help the overall statistics of Mark Andrews, I can certainly promise you that it will. If you bring in other wide receivers and you can get out of 3rd and long situations because you actually have talent at the position instead of Willie Snead or Miles Boykin, you can get out of these situations, get down into the red zone, and activate Mark Andrews. In the last 2 seasons, Mark Andrews has been 2nd in the NFL in team end zone target share, 37% going in his direction. On top of that statistic, as of the last 2 seasons, he's been number 1 amongst all tight ends in team air yards per share. That's 28%. He is going to get opportunity. They just got to get him down into that red zone and activate him. And very easily, like he's proven already, score upwards of 10 plus touchdowns. And if he gets into that double-digit number this season, could even surpass this 5 overall ranking. But as of right now, I have a lot of confidence in him as my number 5 overall tight end going into this upcoming season. We move on to our number 4, TJ Hockenson. TJ Hockenson last year finished as the number 4 overall tight end. Luckily, he had Matthew Stafford to help him. In the 15 games that Matthew Stafford was healthy and playing, TJ Hockenson averaged 9.17 fantasy points per game. A little bit less than Mark Andrews, but I think that this upcoming season is far more promising based on how this offense is looking going into 2021. Last season, in the 15 games that he played with Matthew Stafford, he had 10 games of 5+ targets. And, to be honest, it may not seem like 5 targets is a lot, but when he got 5+ targets last year, he averaged 11.23 fantasy points per game, which was significantly more than his normal average. So just get him the ball and he's going to produce. Of course, every tight end wants to have touchdowns, and though he wasn't able to get into that double-digit range, I think there's a very high possibility of him doing so this upcoming season. If we look at what he had last year in terms of opportunity, he ran 455 routes and had 95 total targets. That made it a 20.88% target percentage. And in comparison to the amount of passing attempts that Matthew Stafford had, 95 targets, he had an 18.09% target share. The market share on his team wasn't relatively high because, again, they still had Kenny Golladay, Marvin Jones, Danny Amendola. We go ahead and we got rid of all 3 of those pieces this season. The Detroit Lions even got rid of Matthew Stafford and brought in a new quarterback. New head coach, new offensive coordinator. Everything is going to look different, but TJ Hockenson stays the same, and the pieces that they surround him with this year actually help his potential case for being the number 4 overall tight end and maybe even advancing to the next level. It's a very high possibility, and I'll explain to you why. This upcoming season, Anthony Lynn will be the offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions. He is formerly of the Los Angeles Chargers and was the play caller there, and when he used Hunter Henry in their offense for the last 2 seasons, on a per game basis, Hunter Henry was targeted 6.5 times per game. In a 16-game season, that's certainly over 100 targets, which bare minimum TJ Hockenson is going to see, because just last season, of course, he had eclipsed over 100 targets, not with Matthew Stafford because of that one game that Matthew Stafford left with an injury, but overall, he had eclipsed 100 targets, which again is going to be a huge part of his overall productivity and potential this year. Besides bringing in Anthony Lynn, they are changing the quarterback position. They are bringing in Jared Goff. Jared Goff and Tyler Higbee were an absolute unstoppable force from weeks 13 through 17 of the 2019 season. In fact, that combination allowed Tyler Higbee, of all tight ends in the world, imagine Tyler Higbee was averaging 17.14 fantasy points per game throughout that stretch, had 4 games of 100 plus receiving yards, and had 56 targets in that span of 5 games. Averaging 10 targets per game is no joke, but I honestly really do believe there's a possibility in which TJ Hockenson could end up getting those numbers. And why that may be the case, they have nobody else to throw the ball to. Literally, I'm not kidding, they have nobody else to throw the ball to. Their best receivers as of right now are Brashad Perriman, Tyrell Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who is a rookie that they just drafted out of USC, Quintez Cephas, Khalif Raymond. I mean, who? Okay, I understand. Some of these guys have been relatively active in fantasy football, and maybe you've started them on your team, but they haven't been guys that are ever competing for close to 100 targets. TJ Hockenson is going to be this entire offense, and especially because this team is not very good defensively, they're going to be throwing the ball for probably every single game in the second half nonstop. TJ Hockenson is going to be unstoppable in the fact that, of course, Jared Goff loves to pass the ball to tight ends. In the past 2 seasons, Jared Goff has targeted his tight ends 264 times, that ranked 5th amongst all quarterbacks, and has accumulated 2,102 receiving yards from receptions from his respective tight ends, that ranked 5th amongst all quarterbacks in the past 2 seasons. He loves to throw the ball to tight ends. You bring in an offense coordinator that has effectively used his tight ends over the last couple of seasons, and you have an offense that has no other receiving talent, guys. It's a surefire number 4 overall, and I honestly, like I mentioned before, think TJ Hockenson can maybe even surpass that, drop off in production average of 168 points. I think that's going to be the bare minimum of what he's able to do this upcoming season. Had a lot of success in the division against his division rivals like the Vikings, Packers, and or Chicago Bears. He's averaged 10.65 fantasy points like he did last year. So why not go ahead and invest in a guy like TJ Hockenson? All right, we move on to our number 3 tight end, George Kittle. Welcome back, George Kittle. I know you've been injured for the last couple seasons, but let's not forget what George Kittle is capable of. I mean, in 2019 and in 2018, he was an unstoppable wide receiver, finishes the number 2 and number 3 at his respective position. And if we go ahead and we just extrapolate the statistics of the games that he played in the last 3 seasons, he's averaged 13.04 fantasy points per game. That's in 38 games. 28 of those games, 7+ targets. Now, why exactly am I mentioning 7+ targets? Because in those games, he's averaged 14.6 fantasy points. He's also had himself 9 games of over 100 receiving yards, and back in 2018 was competing with Travis Kelce for the record of most receiving yards by tight end in a singular season. So let's not forget what exactly George Kittle is capable of. I mean, in 2018, 88 receptions, 1,377 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns. When I go ahead and extrapolate the statistics of him in games that he's played over the last 3 seasons, 306 total targets on 1,118 total routes run. That's a 27.37% target percentage. If we go ahead and just take it amongst all the passing attempts in the games that he's played in, he has a 25.75% market share and target share in his own respective team. Certainly one out of every 4 passes is going in his direction. The statistics don't even stop there with George Kittle. Against the NFC West, the guy's averaged 12.92 fantasy points per game. He's led all receiving options in the National Football League since 2018 with 909 receiving yards after contact. Number 1 in the league again. He is a different machine. He might be the Terminator, and I know he gets injured a lot, and that's kind of counterintuitive, but to be honest, he's just built different. He really is. Because he's been able to acquire these statistics with nobody's at the quarterback position. I mean, Nick Mullins, CJ Beathard, I know Jimmy Garoppolo has shown himself to be decent, but if you can really inject Trey Lance, who, again, was a high pick for a reason, and he's going to elevate this offense that much more, imagine what George Kittle could be capable of this upcoming season. I truly think he could even get back on track, potentially be the number 2 at the position, but it's going to be difficult to compete with a guy like Darren Waller. Nonetheless, even last season, after he came back from his injury, week 16 and 17, the guy showed up and was a fantasy stud. He finished with 10+ points in back-to-back weeks. I mean, are you kidding me? The issue with George Kittle, and there's really only just one issue, it's the fact that he doesn't score a lot of touchdowns. The most touchdowns he scored in a season was 5, both in 2018 and 2019. If he can eclipse that number, get himself upwards, potentially if you get into that double-digit range, Travis Kelce would be shaking in his boots because he would potentially lose his number 1 overall spot that he's had for the last 5 years. Either way, I think George Kittle, we've seen his productivity, we've seen his potential. If you can go ahead and improve this offense, because again, they've surrounded him with more weapons, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, you're bringing in running backs that could potentially catch out of the backfield, expand this offense. You've got yourself a pretty solid offensive line because they've brought in talent. Again, Trent Williams, one of the best, if not the best left tackle in the National Football League as of right now. My goodness, we could see George Kittle take the next step. He's just got to stay healthy. He's got to score touchdowns. All right, we move on to our number 2 option, making it pretty easy. Again, Darren Waller shouldn't be a surprise. In the past 2 seasons, he's been the number 2 and number 3 overall tight end in fantasy and a half PPR scoring format. In fact, he's averaged 12.53 fantasy points per game in that 32-game span. 22 of those games, 7+ targets. In games in which he was targeted 7+ times, a 15.36 fantasy point per game average. Unbelievable numbers. 10+ games of 100+ receiving yards. Can you ask for anything more from your tight end like Darren Waller? Like I mentioned earlier with Kyle Pitts, Darren Waller used to be a wide receiver. They transitioned him to being a tight end. So again, lining him up out wide, giving him this many targets. Again, 145 targets this past season. I mean, in terms of the entire National Football League, last season he had the 4th most receptions with 107. He had tied for the 10th most receiving touchdowns with 9 and had the 10th most receiving yards in comparison to all flex positions. When we compare wide receivers, when we compare running backs, he was up there in the upper echelon of players in the National Football League, and it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, last season alone, if we don't include the 2019 season, he averaged 14 points per game. He had finished within the top 5 of his position in a given week, 9 out of the 16 games. Unbelievable productivity, and on top of that, he is garnering so much attention from Derek Carr. It's just unstoppable. Even when Marcus Mariota came in, the guy had over 10 targets. I mean, the offense is built around feeding him the ball. Last season, 145 targets, 557 routes run. That makes it a 26.03% target percentage and a 26.60% target share on his own respective team. That's what we love to see from tight ends that we're investing in highly, and a guy that we're grabbing in the beginning of the 3rd round for a reason. On top of that, against his own division, the AFC West has averaged 12.78 fantasy points per game since 2019 in the 12 games that he's played against them. You know, to be honest, if anybody was going to compete and potentially interfere with Travis Kelce being the number 1 overall tight end for another consecutive season, I could see potentially Darren Waller doing it. In the last 2 seasons alone, Darren Waller has had 255 targets, while Travis Kelce has had 269. He is potentially gaining on him very slowly. And to be honest, I could potentially see an opportunity in which, if in fact Darren Waller scores a couple more touchdowns here and there, he could end up taking the next step and becoming a number 1 overall tight end. And an investment like that in the potential 3rd round, that's something that I absolutely want to take advantage of if in fact it could potentially happen. I mean, we shouldn't even look at Darren Waller as a tight end. Though he is filling that 1 start position and you're going to have him for every week except for his bye week, he really is a wide receiver. And in comparison to wide receivers, when he's scoring 225 points like he did last year, that's better fantasy point productivity than the wide receiver 8, which was Adam Thielen. If you go ahead and throw Kelce in that conversation, we just combined wide receivers and tight ends because again, they're producing from the same statistic line. Last year, Darren Waller would have been in the number 9 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. Just take that into perspective. A lot of people don't invest into him early, but you should certainly consider it. We're going to go ahead and move on to our last tight end option, the number 1 at the position, a guy that has finished as the number 1 tight end 5 consecutive seasons, Travis Kelce. Since 2018, when Patrick Mahomes took the quarterback position and took the league by storm, Travis Kelce has been unstoppable. In the games that they've played together during the regular season, where Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes were on the field for the entire game, Travis Kelce has averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game. The reason I want to reiterate both them playing is because in that Thursday night football game against the Denver Broncos in 2019, where Patrick Mahomes specifically dislocated his knee, he was out of the first quarter, and then, of course, Travis Kelce's statistic dipped. And then, of course, he didn't play with Mahomes the 2 following weeks. That's why I wanted to reiterate that. So in the 44 games that they've played together since 2018, a 15.4 fantasy point per game average. 33 games out of those 44, 8+ targets. When he's been targeted 8+ times, he's averaged 17.3 fantasy points and he's had 13 games of 100 plus receiving yards. In comparison to what Alex Smith was able to do with Travis Kelce was averaging only 11 fantasy points per game with Alex Smith under center. It's a pretty big difference. Now, if we go ahead and just look at the last 28 games that Travis Kelce has played, he's averaged 17.39 fantasy points per game. That's including the playoffs. Because again, in the playoffs, he's garnered an unbelievable amount of targets, and I think that is going to persist because the offense is surrounding him. If you look at how many targets Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill have gotten over the last couple seasons, Travis Kelce blows him out. It's not even close. Travis Kelce is the number one receiving option of this offense, and he has made that abundantly clear, and Andy Reid has made that abundantly clear as they continue to force feed him the ball. Now again, Travis Kelce is coming off of his career-defining performance, and hopefully he can continue to expand upon it, but he was only 0.24 fantasy points behind the second greatest fantasy tight end performance of all time, which was Jimmy Graham's in the early 2010s. Another career-defining performance. And the season that he just had, if you had drafted him in the second round, you were absolutely paid dividends because he was a top 10 tight end every single week except for week 7 against the Denver Broncos. In fact, he was a top 5 tight end for 10 out of his 15 total games played, and the number 1 overall tight end in 5 out of the 15 games he played. Imagine, 33% of the time, this guy is the number 1 overall guy in the specific week, producing upwards of 15 fantasy points. An incredible investment to say the very least. Now, of course, in 2 out of the last 3 seasons, he has surpassed 10 plus touchdowns, and that's definitely been a biggest difference maker in terms of whether or not he was going to jump into that next category of tight end and potentially become one of the greats. And of course, he's very easily done that with Patrick Mahomes certainly helping him out a lot. But as I look at Travis Kelce and I look at the fact that he's had 24% of his team's target percentage and 24.66% of his team's target share and has averaged 15.74 fantasy points per game in the 16 games he's played against the AFC West as of late. My goodness, could we ask for anything more from Travis Kelce? He has been unbelievable, and I don't see him slowing down in this offense. Travis Kelce has scored 25 points, 35 points, and 21 points, more than the second best tight end in the last 3 consecutive seasons. That's a 27 fantasy point average in terms of total drop-off. So when everyone looks at Travis Kelce at the end of the first round and they think to themselves, is it worth to invest in him? When we go ahead and take his 15.4 fantasy point per game average as of the last 3 seasons with Patrick Mahomes, of course that's 140 plus points. Let's compare that to the RB9 and the wide receiver 4. Sure, the wide receiver 4, as of the last couple seasons, has produced certainly more fantasy points than that, but how do we know the wide receiver 4 is going to be the wide receiver 4? We know the consistency of Travis Kelce. He is going to be the number 1. We know the drop-off in production. In comparison from the tight end 1 to potentially getting a tight end in the 3rd/4th round, think about who you'd be investing in the 3rd/4th round. If you don't take Kelce in the 1st or 2nd, the draft's coming back to you. Kelce's gone. Kittle's gone. Waller's gone. You want to invest in TJ Hockenson in the 3rd/4th round? Sure, but that's not an investment that I want to make. That's why they're not drafted there. Because in terms of total drop-off of productivity, they're not worth that selection. In terms of average productivity, as of the last 3 seasons, Travis Kelce is in line for another incredible season. Again, with his 15.4 fantasy point per game average, I mean, that could potentially line up to him, completely taking the league by storm once again and being an incredible investment. So either way, that is my thought process going into the 2021 fantasy football season and my top 6 tight end rankings. Thank you everybody for watching. If you have not yet already, subscribe to the channel, click that like button down below, and let me know down in the comment section who you guys think should be in this list if they have not been mentioned. Again, there are other guys like Dallas Goedert, but again, Zach Ertz is there. Noah Fant could take that next leap, but again, that offense with Drew Lock isn't promising. Robert Tonyan certainly was the number 3 tight end last year, but is he going to score double-digit touchdowns for another consecutive season? These are the questions, and we'll talk about it for the entirety of the offseason. But without further ado, I want to thank you guys for watching today, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.